All right, let's continue talking about some of these attempts to establish some sort of a system within an expanding socially complex communities between the Neolithic and the beginnings of the urban revolution. And one place that we can turn our attention to is quite famous is Stonehenge. Stonehenge has over the years had lots of mythology around it and lots of frivolous interpretations that aren't really based on scientific fact. And these speculations go back a long way. The Romans didn't really know what these things were for. They described in some texts, Julius Caesar's campaigns in Gaul talks about the Druids, but a lot of these texts were written to denigrate the enemies of Rome and to make them seem like inhuman characters that ought to be eliminated, and Rome was so much better, and so there's no problem in eliminating them or eliminating their culture. Druids, the Danes or Greeks, were speculated to have been behind its construction, and more recently neo-paganism and neo-druidism have tried to reclaim this as a mystical center where there's energies and ley lines, and all of this has no foundation in scientific fact. We actually know a lot scientifically about Stonehenge, what it is, how it was constructed, and it's a very long process, and who did it. But the first thing to remember about Stonehenge is it's not a thing. It is many things that were built continuously over 1,000 years and was used for even a longer period of time. And very importantly, it's not an inhabitation. People didn't live at this site of Stonehenge. It's a focal point in a landscape. And once again, it seems to have been some sort of a meeting place, a place where intersecting territories were coinciding. And people are the ones who define territories. People have to negotiate what those territories mean. And so when you have regions of groups of people within regions, and you come to a corner where several of them meet, you've got to negotiate. And so, but the important thing is that communities change and adapt and expand and contract and jockey for positions. And so the meaning of this locality also changed through time. And that found expression in a series of constructions. And so the first phase in the late Neolithic began about 5,000 years ago, so about 3000 BC. And phase 2, also in the Neolithic, took place over about a 500-year period from about 5,000 to 4,500. And then in the Bronze Age, when you start to have maybe not state formation, but a more complex communities and perhaps complex chiefdoms, you see a phase 3 that lasted about 1,000 years, 4,500 to about 3,500 years ago. When we talk about Stonehenge, the henge itself is not the stones. A henge is the ditch. It's actually a ditch and berm construction that's circular in this case. The henge is an earthwork. It is not, and so you can have Woodhenge is another monument in the same area in the Salisbury Plain. There's lots of henge monuments that don't have stones. And so the stones aren't really the feature that makes it, that we call a henge. But Stonehenge, of course, is a very famous for its stones. But the earliest phase was this earthwork ditch. It's round, it's 110 meters in diameter, and it has slight embankments inside and outside of it, and it seems as though animal bones were put into this ditch. Also, there were a ring of holes in this early first phase on the inside of this ditch. So there may have been some kind of a structure. These are called the Aubrey holes. There could have been wooden posts which were either freestanding or supported some kind of a structure. Phase 2, also in the late Neolithic, we see burials and a timber structure, a round ditch, and the Aubrey holes, these earlier post holes, are filled in. And in the fill of some of these Aubrey holes are the remains of humans. And some of them have been dated to phase 1. So this is sort of on the cusp of the two. And so there are some standing timber posts near the monument in the center as well. And then phase 3 has multiple subphases, which lasted about 1,000 years. Stone monuments were erected in 6 subphases. The first was the phase 3A, the blue stones. This is a central ring of standing stones. And they are these are 2.2 feet or 2.2 to 2.25 meters high, which 2 meters is about 6.5 feet or so. These were quarried and transported from 250 kilometers or 150 miles away in the Preseli Mountains in Wales. So how they got there is a question. Most believe that they were transported, and there could have been some water routes to help facilitate that. But it's also possible that these are glacial erratics that were carried by glaciers and left by the melting glaciers as they were pushed along by them. Phase 3B has the monoliths erected. They're very hard sandstone that are quarried and transported from about 30 kilometers away from Sarsen, and so they're called the Sarsen stones. And they have the lintels. These are the horizontal connecting stones along the top, which are in a circle formation in the central area of the Stonehenge. And also Sarsen sandstone makes up the trilithons, which have jointed lintels in a horseshoe pattern facing northeast inside this Sarsen circle. And these are huge at 7 meters high, with 23 feet. And then we have some later phases, phases C through F, where the final arrangement of the blue stones, horseshoe inside the trilithons, and between the trilithons and Sarsen circle, and concentric rings of pits, and also concentric holes outside of the circle. The location in the landscape is very important for Stonehenge. If you stand at Stonehenge, you can actually, and you look out on the landscape, you'll see mounds on the horizon. And these are all where you can see, you look over there, and you look over there, and you look over there, and you look in 360 degrees, and there are these earthwork mounds that are on the horizon. And these are built during the same time period. And we have some of them are for burials, and there are some pathways that were erected to go between some of these monuments in the landscape. So Stonehenge isn't a standalone entity. It is a piece within a landscape that connects multiple pieces together. There's the avenue, which is a path with embankments and ditches. It's a half a mile in length between the River Avon and Stonehenge. There's the Cursus Mound, which is an earthen platform nearly 2 miles long, running east and west, and might even predate the Henge, in fact. And then we have Durrington Walls, which is a late Neolithic Phase 3B series of houses and a possible village site with 3 monumental wood circles. That's across the river and separated from the area of Stonehenge. We'll talk a little bit about this in a moment. The organization and planning of this needed some labor, food, stone, housing, transportation. So this needed some organization to do. It was a big job. But again, it wasn't all done at once. It was done over 1,000 years. So this was something that communities would feel the need and motivation to do a project. They would work together. And this does not necessarily mean that there was some absolute ruler or absolute control. And in fact, it could be soft power between communities, perhaps redistributing resources, maybe using this as a way to build communities between groups. Colin Renfrew, whom we've seen before, he has an idea about this, that this was a way to establish elite status for local chiefdoms. And a bigger henge, a bigger project would mean that you actually can claim more territory or more power or more authority amongst these competing groups. As a hypothesis, what you would expect with this is that you would start to see elite burials. If this is what you're proposing is the case, then where are these elites? Where do we find differential burials with some with greater grave goods buried with them? And as if on cue, in 2002, 2 burials with elite goods were found. So it's quite likely that Colin Renfrew's idea has some merit to it. The Amesbury Archer, for instance, was buried 3 miles from Stonehenge, and this was during the early Bronze Age, the phases C through F, phase 3, found with rich grave goods and display items from all over the place. And actually, isotope analysis has shown that this person was born and lived early life in the European Alps. And so this was actually someone coming from outside of the area. And a second burial also was found with similar grave goods. And these, of course, support Renfrew's hypothesis of status improvement by local chieftains working to build bigger and bigger and better monuments. So Stonehenge is interesting because it doesn't have any domestic inhabitations in the monument itself or even very close to it. But the surrounding plain was originally forested until agriculture and grazing cleared it. So perhaps part of that effort to clear it may have something to do with the horizons clearing as well, and these mounds. So you're actually manufacturing a new landscape with Stonehenge, at least in a central part of that. So it's possible that this had some sort of ritual significance, some spiritual significance. Once again, we're talking about cosmology, how you think of the organization, not just of how you organize your life, but how the universe is constructed. So this is similar not just to the things in the surrounding area, but all of Western Europe has henge monuments and standing stones and circles and causeways and pathways on the mainland as well. Carnac in France. Some of these are aligned with celestial bodies, so maybe tracking the seasons or the years, observatories, and perhaps some with religious configurations. So what does this all mean? Because it's built over such a long period, you can't say that it has a meaning. It probably had multiple meanings that changed through time as society was transforming, as it was becoming more complex, it meant new things to different people. What happens when you are 500 years into this process? Do you remember who the original builders of the original ditch were? Maybe not. It means something to you now, though. It's part of a process that is relevant to your current life. And what you're doing may not be what someone else thinks about the monument 500 years in the future. So, how do we understand it as archaeologists? Well, we have to sort of use some of our theoretical tools, right? And it's not easy, and we can't get too far ahead of our skis here. Some archaeologists try to use phenomenological approaches or experiential approaches. That what does it feel like to be there? What does the sound sound like? How do you move through the monument? Is there some sort of syntax? Is there a segregated area that only some people can get to, like a holy of holies? Is it a temple? Is it forbidden access? Some people think that it never really had any meaning. It just was an expression of social realities. And Ian Hodder talks about the fact that households, the formation of house and home, was starting at this time. The Neolithic Revolution was establishing territoriality, and this was just a way to put a marker on this place and to say that this is ours, communally and individually. Mike Parker Pearson it has recently been excavating at Durrington Walls across the river and a little bit distant, but in the same area. And he sees where he's excavated as the location where these communities congregated. So if Stonehenge is a place of congregation where people negotiate, why is there nothing there except for big monuments? Well, it seems as though Mike Parker Pearson would argue that this was a special place that only a few elite people had access to, unless, of course, you were working on it or you had a special elite status. But Durrington Walls is where the regular people went. And this was domestic, but perhaps seasonal. So it wasn't maybe a permanent residence, but it was maybe a place where festivals took place and multiple communities came together to perhaps negotiate territoriality and interact from different regions. And it was also a land of the living. The burials didn't take place at Durrington Walls. This was where the living people gathered across the river and up the hill. That's where the dead were. That was the land of the ancestors. That's where you venerated your spirituality. That's where you enacted your rituals. But the party was over at Durrington Walls. And also that's where the politics were. That's where you negotiated between people, living people. And so it's a land of the living and a land of the dead. A land of the permanent and forever, and the temporary campsite. There's the wooden huts that you lived in for a period of time during the festival, and the stone that is there forever. So all of these explanations probably need to be brought together to understand Stonehenge. There's probably no one explanation for it, and there's multiple explanations that can be used by different groups over 80 generations of people. There is no final finished Stonehenge. There was never a plan. There was never any master plan or master architect. It's a product of a expanding and contracting social groups that were interacting, and this was a focal point. And it's a hodgepodge of different times, people, places that we only see as a palimpsest that is got all of them all at once. And that's what archaeology is really good at, is stretching that out and being able to see, okay, this isn't just one picture, it's multiple pictures over many, many years. So Stonehenge, actually, like I said, we know a lot about. We know a lot about the people, we know a lot about the context, and it doesn't have the necessarily the mystical qualities that were later attributed to it. But for our discussion today, very importantly, there was no state, there was no urban community that made it. But it is the product of expanding hierarchical social structures that were on their way to becoming something that was more than just small villages and egalitarianism, and moving into something that was more akin to complex chiefdoms. Okay, that's it for Stonehenge. We'll come back and we'll talk about a couple more things. See you then.